and welcome to another episode of What Would You Like to Learn Today? I'm Will, and today you would like to learn all about the rings of Saturn, which is convenient because I happen to have prepared a lecture about just that subject. Saturn's rings were first discovered when people built the first telescopes, basically, because before that all you could see of Saturn from Earth was just a little pinprick of light. First telescope was Galileo. In 1610 he looked at Saturn and he saw something kind of peculiar. All the other planets, you look at them and you just see kind of a blob that's vaguely circular, okay, and he had concluded that they were spheres. But when you looked at Saturn, he found that it actually had kind of this weird stuff on either side of it, and he said that it looked like Saturn had ears, basically. And as soon as he saw this, he immediately knew that something was going on very fishy here with Saturn, but that he was going to try to make some money off of it, or at least gain some recognition. So he quickly emailed he didn't email. He sent a letter out to all his friends saying Smail Mermisma Poetileum Ibn Notarius, which is an anagram for Altissimum Planetum Tergiminum Observavi. This is because astronomers are catty bitches and they're also afraid of being embarrassed. So as soon as they discover something new, they want everybody to know that they were the first people to discover it, but they don't necessarily want to reveal what it was that they discovered. So they send out the results in code so that later when they publish their paper, everybody can go back and say, oh, of course, yes, he did figure this out first, okay? Now, Altissimum Planetum Tergiminum Observavi is Latin for I have observed the furthest planet as having a tripartite shape. This is because at that time people thought Saturn was the furthermost planet out. They didn't know about Neptune and Uranus yet. Now, things got a little more complicated there because what happened was you saw that like this in 1610, but in 1612, the Earth and Saturn had moved such that the rings were actually edge-on to the observers on the Earth. So it looked like they disappeared. All right, and then in 1613 they came back when they retilted. So people for a long time are extremely confused about what the heck was going on over in Saturn's orbit. Things became a lot clearer in 1655 when Huygens suggested, what if they're rings? Which was kind of obvious. I wonder why nobody thought of that earlier. Wasn't Galileo supposed to be a genius after all? Then in 1675, Cassini noticed that the rings, people started looking at the rings. Here's a picture that Hooke drew, for example. And they noticed that the rings weren't all one piece. Okay, Cassini noticed that there were actually were several rings, and that there were spaces between them. So it'd be like a ring, a space, another ring, that kind of thing. In 1787, this guy Laplace started trying to figure out what the rings were made of. He had this idea that they were actually solid, like it was a solid ring of rock that was spinning around. But then in 1859, this guy Maxwell did the math on that and figured out that something like that would not be stable. Given the gravitational strain, it would get ripped apart unless it was made of like diamond or something with an absurdly high tensile strength. So at that point, people figured out, all right, it's lots of little tiny particles that are just very well distributed, and it looks like from a far enough distance like it's all one solid piece. They did some spectrographic analysis on it. They figured out that the rings were basically 99.9% water ice, okay, with a little bit of extra stuff thrown in there just for good measure. Now, could you make a little more noise in there?
Sorry.
The thing about these rings is that when you're trying to think about what they're made of, think of them as a bunch of little ice cubes that are running around. Okay, and sometimes they clump up and sometimes they break apart, but the ice cube, they're never going to get much bigger than like a Volkswagen, all right, because of these aforementioned tidal strains. And they're constantly bunking into each other and getting nudged around. The divisions, it turns out, between the rings are caused by the moons, okay, because Saturn doesn't just have rings, it also has moons. And inside each of those divisions that separate the rings, there is a little moon that's going around and it's cleaning up its little region, okay? Some of the gaps are actually caused by larger moons that are further out that have an orbital resonance at a certain point. Usually it's about a third of the way out, and that can cause a gap to form in the middle of the rings as well. Now, last thing about the rings is that we were figuring this all out from Earth, right? And you can't really get a good picture of what's going on from Earth. You have to be there in person, and for us that currently means space probes. The best pictures we've gotten back came from the Cassini probe, which went out there, and it saw some fascinating things. First of all, it saw that the rings were not uniform, that there were patterns within the rings, that are now called spokes. You can see them right there. It's basically caused by the patches of different types of chemicals that are spread throughout the rings. The other thing that they noticed is that not all the rings are perfectly circular. That in fact, many of the rings have kind of a wobble to them. All right, and this wobble was very difficult to understand at first. And it wasn't until Cassini got some footage of two moons doing it in the act that they were able to see what was going on. This is the F ring, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. It's the F ring, and you've got Prometheus and Pandora, which are two moons of Saturn that are going on either side of it. And you'll see that interference pattern that's being caused between them. This is what first gave people the idea about gravitational waves, because it really looks like the two wakes of two ships being interacted in the middle, right? It pretty much shows that gravity has to propagate in wave form, at least at some level. When people first saw this in JPL, which is Jet Propulsion Lab, they didn't see the moons at first, they just saw the weird roiling, and they thought that there was maybe there's an alien spaceship out there that's messing up the ring. Turns out it's just gravity, unfortunately. Now, let's go on. The names of the rings also. Let me mention this. When they're talking about the names of the rings, they all get letters, and they're lettered in order of discovery, not in order of distance out from Saturn. Okay, so what you've actually got is you've got the A ring, the B ring, the C ring, the D ring, which is closest inward to Saturn, and then they found the E ring, and then the F ring, and then the G ring. Okay, and within those rings, of course, there's lots more little tiny discrepancies. It actually looks more like a record player. Well, when you get right up close to it, it looks like an old vinyl. Because there's all these little moons and all these weird little orbital resonances, and oh god, the microstructure is fantastic on these. Some people have talked about how it formed. Since it's all made out of ice, probably what I think happened was that there was a comet that came in and got broken up somehow, or there was an icy moon that got pulled too close and got disintegrated. The reason that the rings are still going is because all those little moons, some of them are in the process of being ripped apart by tidal forces from Saturn's gravity. And this causes there always to be more material being added to the rings. Okay. The one last thing about the rings, some people have suggested, what if we could get some of those chunks of the rings, if we could deorbit them and get them back into the inner system, that might be helpful for terraforming planets, if you'll look at my previous lecture, like Mars or Venus that don't have a whole lot of water. But I really think we need to leave these absolutely undisturbed. This is a natural beauty. Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon and all that has got nothing on these rings. These things are 70,000 kilometers, and the whole thing is like spreading around this gigantic, beautiful gas giant. We should not mess with it at all. I hope we never touch it. Save it as a monument for future generations. Okay, now, lightning round.